In 1949, a television company in Chicago had a problem that no business had ever faced before. Their hit TV show was so popular, so completely, overwhelmingly popular, that Americans were buying their televisions faster than the factory could build them. So the company did something that sounds impossible. They canceled their own show. Not because it was failing, because it was winning too hard. That company was Admiral Corporation, and at its peak, it was one of the most powerful names in American electronics. A brand that put the first television set into millions of living rooms, sponsored the most watched religious program in the history of American broadcasting, and built a manufacturing empire from nothing but $3,400 in borrowed capital in a friend's garage in Depression-era Chicago. By 1973, it was gone, not slowly faded, sold, handed off to a defense contractor that built spacecraft and bombers, and had no idea what to do with the television company. How does the man who brought television into the American home end up losing the industry he created? This is the story of Admiral Corporation and of the Chicago kid who built it from scratch in the era that swallowed it whole. Ross David Siragusa was not supposed to succeed. He was the son of Italian immigrants, raised in Chicago at a time when that combination, immigrant blood, no college degree, no family money, meant you took what work you could find and you were grateful for it. But Siragusa had something that no university could give him and no depression could take away. He understood at a bone-deep level what ordinary people wanted and what they could not yet afford. That gap between wanting and having, that was the space he intended to live in. He had tried before. In the 1920s, he built a company called the Transformer Corporation of America, selling radio parts at a moment when radio was the most exciting technology in the world. By 1929, it was the largest supplier of radio parts in the country. Then the stock market collapsed, and the Depression swallowed everything he had built. Siragusa declared bankruptcy. He was 30 years old, starting over with nothing. Most men would have found a safer path after that, a steadier job, a smaller ambition. Siragusa did the opposite. In 1934, in the deepest trough of the Great Depression, he sold his car. He sold most of the furniture in his house. He scraped together $3,400 in cash, borrowed $5,000 worth of equipment, and knocked on a friend's door asking to use the garage. That was the beginning. No storefront, no investors, no safety net. Just a garage on the north side of Chicago, a man who had already failed once, and an absolute refusal to stay down. He called the new company Continental Radio and Television Corporation. The radios were small, affordable, and aimed directly at the working families and middle-class households that the big names, RCA, Zenith, Motorola, had never bothered to court. Those companies built expensive equipment for people who could afford expensive things. Siragusa built decent equipment for everyone else. Within 2 years, annual sales had crossed $2 million. Within 5 years, they were approaching $9 million. For a company started in a garage with borrowed tools during the worst economic crisis in American history, that was not a comeback. That was a statement. In 1936, Siragusa spent $200 on a trademark. The name was Admiral, a naval rank that carried weight, authority, and a kind of plain American dignity. He did not know yet that this $200 purchase would one day be worth hundreds of millions. He only knew that it sounded right. It sounded like something you could trust. When World War II arrived, Continental Radio pivoted entirely to military production. The company supplied the United States Armed Forces with electronic equipment, communications gear, navigation instruments, the invisible infrastructure of a war being fought across 2 oceans. The work was demanding and the stakes were absolute. Admiral, as the company was now commonly called, earned the Army-Navy E Award for Excellence in Production. The garage in Chicago had become a manufacturer of consequence, but the war also did something else for Ross Siragusa. It showed him what his company was truly capable of when it was pushed. The factories ran around the clock. The workforce expanded. The engineering team solved problems under pressure that would have seemed impossible 5 years earlier in peacetime. When the war ended in 1945 and America turned its attention back to itself, to buying houses, starting families, filling those houses with the comfort and convenience that the Depression and the war had denied for 15 years. Siragusa was ready. He had factories. He had engineers. He had a brand name that Americans were beginning to recognize. And he had spotted earlier than almost anyone else in his industry what was coming next. Television, not radio, not phonographs, not refrigerators, though those would follow. Television, the technology that would reorganize American domestic life more completely than anything since indoor plumbing. Siragusa entered the television market in 1948, and from the moment Admiral's first sets hit the shelves, he applied the same philosophy that had guided him since the garage. Build it well enough to be proud of, price it low enough that a factory worker in Galesburg could bring one home. His son, Ross Siragusa Jr., would later say that product development was his father's strongest suit. That was true, but the deeper truth was that Ross Sr. had an instinct for the moment, for reading what America needed before America had fully articulated the need. He had done it with radio parts in the 20s. He had done it with affordable radios in the 30s. He had done it with military electronics in the 40s. Now, in the post-war boom, with returning veterans buying homes in the suburbs and young families gathering in living rooms that had never before held anything more entertaining than a radio, Ross Siragusa was about to do it again, on a scale that would make everything that came before look like rehearsal. To understand what Admiral meant to America in the early 1950s, you have to understand what television meant to America in the early 1950s. This was not a product launch. This was not a consumer trend. This was a reorganization of daily life so complete and so sudden that nothing in the previous century of American experience had prepared anyone for it. Families that had gathered around a radio in the evenings now gathered around a screen. Neighbors who had never had much reason to visit each other found themselves knocking on doors to watch a broadcast together. Children who had played outside until dark began coming inside earlier, pulled by something glowing in the corner of the living room that had not existed in their homes 12 months before. Admiral was at the center of that transformation. In 1949, the company produced 400,000 television sets. The following year, 1950, it manufactured more than 1 million. The year after that, 5 million sets moved through Admiral's factories and out into American homes. These were not abstract numbers on a production report. Each one of those sets was carried through a front door somewhere. In Ohio, in Texas, in California, in 100 small Illinois towns within driving distance of the Chicago plants. Each one represented a family making a decision that felt, at the time, like stepping into the future. The sets themselves were built for real life, not for showrooms. While competitors were producing large, expensive cabinet models aimed at affluent buyers, Admiral was making smaller tabletop sets in Bakelite plastic casings. Brown, compact, honest-looking machines that fit on a shelf or a side table without demanding that you rearrange the room around them. A 17-inch Admiral tabletop model in 1954 sold for around $150, the equivalent of roughly $1,300 today. That was not cheap. For a factory worker earning $85 a month, it was a significant sacrifice. But it was reachable, and that was exactly the point. What was it about that logo, the clean lettering, the straightforward name, that made a family feel like they were buying something solid, something American, something that would last? One woman who donated her family's 1954 Admiral T-112B to a museum in Western Illinois decades later remembered exactly why they had chosen it. Her husband was stationed in San Diego during the Korean War, earning $85 a month as a Navy petty officer. They were young, newly married, living in their first apartment together. They saved for the set deliberately and carefully, the way young couples in that era saved for things that mattered. When they finally brought it home, she said, it felt like the apartment became a home. That television, that Admiral, was woven into the first years of her married life in a way that nothing else from that period was. That story repeated itself in different forms, in living rooms across the country. Admiral was not the only television manufacturer in America, but it occupied a specific and important place in the market. The brand that made the dream accessible, that bridged the distance between wanting and having, for the families who could not afford the top of the line but refused to go without entirely. The company's relationship with television went beyond manufacturing. Admiral was one of the first major corporations in America to understand that television could sell television. In 1948 and 1949, Siragusa made a bet that almost no one else was willing to make. He sponsored a live variety program on NBC called the Admiral Broadway Review, starring a young comedian named Sid Caesar and his partner Imogene Coca. The show was funny, genuinely, remarkably funny, and audiences responded immediately. Ratings climbed, and with the ratings, sales of Admiral television sets climbed right alongside them. Then something happened that no one had planned for. The show became too popular. Demand for Admiral sets outpaced everything the factories could produce. Customers were walking into stores asking for Admiral televisions that simply did not exist yet on the shelves because the assembly lines could not keep up. Siragusa faced a choice that would have seemed absurd in any business school case study. He could build a new factory to meet demand, or he could cancel the show. He canceled the show. Since Admiral owned the program outright, it could not be handed to another sponsor and continued. It simply ended after 19 weeks at the height of its popularity. Sid Caesar, who did not learn the real reason for the cancellation until months later, recalled the moment Siragusa finally told him the truth over lunch in Chicago. The show had not been canceled because it was failing. It had been canceled because it was working so well that the company's own infrastructure could not survive the success. Caesar said he never forgot that conversation. There was something in it, a kind of magnificent, only-in-America absurdity that stayed with him for the rest of his life. Admiral recovered its footing and returned to television sponsorship with even greater ambition. In 1952, the company became the sponsor of a program on the DuMont network called Life is Worth Living, hosted by Bishop Fulton J. Sheen. On paper, a Catholic bishop speaking directly to camera about moral philosophy should not have been one of the most watched programs in the country. In practice, Sheen drew 30 million viewers a week. He competed directly against Milton Berle, the biggest entertainment star in America at the time, and held his own. He won the Emmy Award for Most Outstanding Television Personality in 1953. And every Tuesday evening, before Sheen appeared on screen, an Admiral commercial ran, putting the brand in front of 30 million American households in a single broadcast. For workers inside the Cortlandt Street plant in Chicago and at the satellite facilities in Galesburg and Bloomington and Harvard, Illinois, those were years of a particular kind of pride. The factory ran multiple shifts. Employment across Admiral's Illinois operations reached 6,000 by 1953. These were union jobs with wages that could support a family, in an era when that combination, steady work, decent pay, a product you were not ashamed of, represented everything the post-war American economy was supposed to deliver. Men who had come back from the war found work at Admiral and stayed for decades. Their children sometimes followed them in. By the early 1960s, annual sales had reached $300 million. The company employed approximately 8,500 people. Admiral had manufacturing operations not just in Illinois, but in Canada, England, where it had acquired a Marconi factory, and operations extending into Mexico, Italy, Taiwan, and India. The brand that Ross Siragusa had named after spending $200 on a trademark was now recognized in 110 countries. And then quietly, almost invisibly, the first number that mattered turned the wrong direction. In 1956, Admiral cut its dividend. It would not pay one again for 9 years. Most customers never noticed. Most employees went on with their work. The living rooms of America were still full of Admiral televisions, and the name still meant something real and solid and trustworthy to the people who owned them. But somewhere inside the balance sheets, a pressure was building that the gleaming surfaces of the brand could not yet reveal. Success in business has a particular kind of gravity. Once a company reaches a certain size, a certain momentum, stopping feels more dangerous than continuing. The question stops being whether to grow and becomes only how fast and in which direction. For Admiral Corporation in the mid-1950s, the answer to both questions was faster and everywhere. The television business had given Siragusa something more valuable than revenue. It had given him capital, credibility, and a manufacturing infrastructure that most of his competitors could not match. Factories that could produce television sets by the millions could, with the right retooling, produce almost anything that ran on electricity. And in post-war America, the appetite for electric appliances was essentially bottomless. Families moving into new suburban homes wanted refrigerators. They wanted electric ranges. They wanted air conditioners for the summers and phonographs for the evenings, and washing machines that would free up the hours their mothers had spent at the washboard. Admiral intended to sell them all of it. The expansion into major appliances began in the early 1950s, riding directly on the profits of the television boom. Refrigerators came first, then electric ranges, then freezers, room air conditioners, dehumidifiers, and stereophonic phonographs. Each new product line was positioned the same way the original radios and televisions had been, well made enough to be worth buying, priced low enough that the working and middle-class families Admiral had always served could actually afford them. The brand logic was consistent. Admiral was the name you trusted when you could not afford to waste money on something that would let you down. By 1962, Admiral listed 4 manufacturing plants in Illinois alone, collectively employing nearly 6,000 workers in the state. The flagship headquarters and primary factory sat at 3800 West Cortlandt Street in Chicago, a full industrial complex that had grown, building by building, from the modest operation Siragusa had established in the late 1930s. Additional facilities operated in Galesburg, Bloomington, and Harvard, Illinois. A plant in Toronto had been running since 1946, Admiral's first international footprint. By the mid-1950s, the company had acquired a Marconi factory in England, making Admiral one of only 2 American brands, alongside General Electric, to establish a genuine manufacturing presence in both home appliances and consumer electronics on an international scale. The global push accelerated through the late 1950s and into the 1960s. Operations opened in Mexico, Italy, Taiwan, and India. By 1966, Admiral employed 14,000 people worldwide and conducted business in 110 countries. The company that Ross Siragusa had started with $3,400 and a borrowed garage had become, by any reasonable measure, a multinational corporation of the first rank. Revenue told the same story. Sales that had stood at $2 million in the mid-1930s climbed to roughly $300 million by the early 1960s, then kept climbing, $347 million in 1967, pushing past $600 million by 1973. From the outside, these numbers look like the trajectory of a company that had figured out how to win and intended to keep winning indefinitely. But revenue and profit are not the same thing. They never are. And in Admiral's case, the distance between those two numbers was quietly becoming a chasm. The problem with expanding into every category of consumer electronics and home appliances simultaneously was that it required Admiral to be excellent at everything at once. In the early days, the company had one core competency: affordable, reliable consumer electronics, and it executed that competency with discipline and focus. As the product line expanded to encompass dozens of different appliances, each with its own engineering requirements, supply chains, and competitive dynamics, that focus inevitably diluted. Admiral was no longer a company that did one thing exceptionally well. It was a company that did many things adequately. In a market where adequacy was enough, that was a sustainable position. In a market where a new kind of competitor was about to redefine what adequate even meant, it was a vulnerability hiding behind a revenue number. That competitor was not American. Through the late 1950s and into the 1960s, Japanese electronics manufacturers had been studying the American market with a patience and precision that their domestic counterparts had not bothered to match. Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, these were not companies dumping inferior products at cut-rate prices. They were engineering organizations that had identified exactly where American manufacturers like Admiral were leaving performance and value on the table, and they were building products designed to exploit those gaps. Their televisions were smaller, lighter, and more reliable. Their manufacturing costs were lower, and they were arriving on American store shelves in growing numbers at precisely the moment when Admiral's profit margins were already under pressure from rising labor and material costs at home. In 1956, Admiral cut its dividend for the first time. It would not restore that dividend for 9 full years. The official explanations pointed to investment in expansion, to the costs of retooling factories, to the normal pressures of rapid growth. All of those things were true, but underneath the official explanations was a simpler truth that the balance sheets were beginning to reveal. The company was spending more to make and sell its products than the market was willing to pay for them, and the gap was not closing. When Ross Siragusa retired in 1969, he handed a company with $400 million in annual sales and 14,000 employees to his son, Ross Jr. By every external measure, the transition looked like the orderly succession of a healthy enterprise. But Siragusa Sr. had spent 40 years making decisions based on instincts built from the ground up, from the garage, from the Depression, from the war contracts, from the television boom. Ross Jr. was inheriting an organization that had grown beyond the reach of any single person's instincts in a market that was shifting beneath its feet in ways that no amount of inherited wisdom could fully address. The Admiral had left the bridge, and the waters ahead were not the same waters he had navigated on the way up. There is a particular kind of American company that stops being just a company at some point and becomes something closer to a shared fixture of national life, not a luxury, not a novelty. A fixture, the kind of thing that is simply there, in the background of everyday experience, so consistent and so present that its absence would feel like a removal of something structural. Admiral, at the height of its powers in the late 1950s and through the 1960s, had become exactly that kind of company. The television set was the centerpiece of the American living room in a way that is difficult to fully reconstruct today, when screens are everywhere and attention is fragmented across a dozen devices simultaneously. In 1955 and 1960 and 1965, there was one screen. It sat in one room. The family gathered around it at specific times to watch specific things, and those shared viewings created a texture of common experience that cut across class lines and geography in ways that almost nothing else in American life managed to do. A factory worker in Galesburg, Illinois, and a middle manager in Pasadena, California, might have had very little in common. But on Tuesday evenings, they were both watching Bishop Sheen. On Saturday nights, they were both watching whatever their Admiral set could pull in from the nearest broadcast tower. The brand had achieved something that most manufacturers only dream about. It had made itself synonymous with the experience it enabled. You did not watch television and happen to own an Admiral. You watched Admiral. The set and the experience had fused in the minds of the families who owned them, the way a particular kitchen table fuses with the memory of every meal ever eaten at it. By the early 1960s, Admiral's annual sales had reached $300 million. The company employed approximately 8,500 people. Its advertising ran in every major American magazine. Life, Look, the Saturday Evening Post, depicting the same image again and again: a well-furnished living room, a family arranged comfortably around a glowing screen, and somewhere in the frame, the Admiral name, solid and unhurried, confirming that this was the right choice for people who took their home seriously. The cultural reach extended beyond advertising. Admiral had been one of the first major corporations in America to understand that sponsoring television was not just marketing. It was participation in the national conversation. The company's association with Bishop Fulton Sheen's Life is Worth Living had put the Admiral name in front of 30 million viewers every Tuesday evening for 3 years. When the program moved from DeMont to ABC in 1955, Admiral's profile moved with it. There was a generation of American Catholics and a much larger audience of non-Catholics who simply found Sheen compelling, for whom the name Admiral was permanently attached to those Tuesday evenings, to the bishop's voice, to the specific quality of attention that his program demanded from its audience. And then there was the moon. On the evening of July 20th, 1969, an estimated 600 million people around the world watched Neil Armstrong step onto the surface of the moon. In the United States alone, the number was approximately 125 million, the largest television audience in American history to that point. Families crowded around their sets in living rooms and dens and kitchens, watching a grainy black and white image that somehow conveyed across 238,000 miles of space something that felt like the most American moment that had ever been broadcast. Millions of those families were watching on Admiral televisions. The sets that Ross Siragusa had started building in a Chicago garage 35 years earlier were now the windows through which Americans watched a human being walk on another world. What it felt like to be an Admiral employee in those years was something that former workers described consistently decades later in the same terms. Pride was the word that came up most often, not pride in an abstract corporate sense, but the specific grounded pride of a person who makes something with their hands that other people genuinely want and use and value. Workers at the Cortlandt Street plant knew that the sets coming off their assembly lines were going into American homes. They knew because they had Admiral sets in their own homes, because their neighbors had them, because the brand was everywhere in the communities where the factories operated. The distance between the people who made the product and the people who used it was essentially zero. That kind of connection between labor and outcome is rarer than it sounds, and the people who experienced it understood its value. The brand had also achieved something that very few American companies manage across a single generation. It had transmitted itself from parents to children without losing meaning in the transfer. The grandparents who had bought Admiral radios in the 1940s raised children who bought Admiral televisions in the 1950s, and those children were now raising their own families with Admiral appliances in the kitchen and an Admiral set in the living room. 3 generations of a single family connected by a brand name that had meant reliability and accessibility and honest American manufacture at every point along the way. That kind of loyalty is not built by marketing. It is built by repeatedly delivering on a promise year after year until the promise and the name become indistinguishable from each other. In 1969, when Ross Siragusa Sr. stepped back from the company he had built over 35 years, Admiral was by every visible measure a success story without qualification. The revenue was climbing. The workforce was the largest it had ever been. The name was recognized around the world. But the dividend had been cut 13 years earlier and never fully restored. Profits in the electronics division had been falling since the mid-1960s. Japanese competitors were taking share in exactly the product categories that had built Admiral's reputation. And a father and son who saw the company's future very differently were about to find out which of them was right. The first shadow had been visible for years. Most people inside and outside the company had simply chosen not to look directly at it. The customers did not notice at first. That is almost always how it goes. The people on the outside of a failing enterprise are the last to know, because the outside is precisely what the company works hardest to maintain. The stores still carried Admiral products. The advertisements still ran in the magazines. The sets still worked. The appliances still hummed. From the living room, nothing had changed. But inside the company, inside the balance sheets and the boardrooms and the engineering departments, the pressure that had been building quietly since the mid-1950s was beginning to find its way to the surface. The primary force driving that pressure had a name, and the name was Japan. This requires some precision because the story of Japanese competition in American electronics is sometimes told as a simple tale of cheap imports undercutting honest domestic manufacturers, a story that flatters American nostalgia without fully accounting for what actually happened. The Japanese electronics industry of the 1960s was not selling inferior products at artificially low prices. It was selling well-engineered products at genuinely lower costs because Japanese manufacturers had invested heavily in production efficiency and component miniaturization in ways that their American counterparts had not matched. Sony's transistor radio, introduced to the American market in 1955, was smaller, lighter, and more reliable than anything an American company was making in the same category. Its televisions, which began arriving in significant numbers through the early 1960s, offered comparable picture quality to Admiral's sets at prices that Admiral's cost structure made impossible to meet. Admiral had built its reputation on being the affordable option in the American market. When a foreign competitor arrived that was more affordable and, in several measurable respects, more reliable, the foundation of that reputation was not just challenged, it was undermined at the root. The profit numbers told the story in the starkest possible terms. Admiral earned $10 million in profit in 1956, a solid return on a company of its size. By 1966, the company was reporting a loss of nearly $4 million. In 10 years, the profit line had swung $14 million in the wrong direction, while revenue continued to climb. This is the particular signature of a cost problem, not a demand problem. People were still buying Admiral products. The company simply could not make and sell those products at a price the market would bear while maintaining the cost structure it had built during the expansion years. The response from management was the response that struggling manufacturers almost always reach for first: cut overhead, improve efficiency, reduce costs at the factory level. Admiral spent the better part of the 1960s attempting to do exactly that, consolidating operations, renegotiating supply contracts, pushing harder on production line efficiency. Some of those efforts produced real savings. None of them produced savings large enough to close the gap that Japanese competition had opened. There was a deeper problem that cost-cutting could not address. Admiral had entered the television market in 1948 as a hardware company, a manufacturer of physical sets competing on price and build quality. By the late 1960s, the television industry was moving toward a world defined increasingly by component sophistication, particularly in color picture tube technology. Admiral had invested in color television manufacturing, but color tubes were expensive to produce and technically demanding to get right. In 1971, the company made a decision that, in hindsight, was the clearest possible signal of how serious its position had become. It sold its color picture tube manufacturing operations to RCA. Think about what that meant. Admiral was selling televisions to American consumers while buying the most critical component of those televisions from a competitor. The company had effectively conceded that it could no longer control its own product at the level that mattered most. Whatever competitive advantage Admiral had once held in television manufacturing, it was now dependent on a rival's technology to maintain even the appearance of that advantage. How long could a brand this trusted, this deeply woven into American domestic life, continue to hold itself together on the strength of a name alone? The answer was becoming visible to anyone who looked carefully, but most people did not look carefully because the surface still held. Admiral sets were still in the stores. The brand still meant something to the families who had grown up with it. The sales numbers, divorced from the profit numbers, still told a story of a company in motion. It was possible, it was easy, to see the revenue climbing towards $600 million by the early 1970s and conclude that Admiral was a healthy enterprise navigating a difficult period. Inside the company, the view was different. Engineers who had spent their careers at Admiral understood that the gap between what they could design and manufacture and what their Japanese competitors were bringing to market was not closing. It was widening. The domestic electronics industry was undergoing a structural shift that could not be reversed by better management or tighter operations. The economics of American manufacturing, with its labor costs and its overhead and its regulatory environment, were simply incompatible with the price points that the new competitive landscape required. This was not a problem that Admiral had created, and it was not a problem that Admiral could solve on its own. But Admiral was the one holding the bill. The internal tension had a human face as well. Ross Siragusa Sr. had retired in 1969, but had not, by most accounts, fully disengaged from the company he had spent 40 years building. His son, Ross Jr., was now running the operation, and the two men saw its future differently in ways that people close to the family described as genuinely irreconcilable. The father had built Admiral through instinct, through personal relationships, through a willingness to make large bets on his own judgment. The son was managing a corporation that had grown too large and too complex for any single person's instincts to navigate reliably. Neither man was wrong exactly, but a company in trouble cannot afford a divided command, and Admiral's command was divided at precisely the moment when clarity and decisiveness were most urgently needed. By 1973, with sales exceeding $600 million, but profits continuing to deteriorate, the board of Admiral Corporation reached a conclusion that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. The company that Ross Siragusa had built from a borrowed garage and $3,400 could not save itself. It needed a buyer. The question was not whether Admiral would be sold. The question was what exactly was left to sell, and whether whoever bought it understood what they were actually acquiring. Rockwell International was not a consumer electronics company. It was not a home appliance company. It was not, in any meaningful sense, a company that understood what it meant to sell a television set to a family in Ohio or a refrigerator to a young couple setting up their first apartment in suburban Illinois. Rockwell built spacecraft. It built bombers. It had manufactured the Apollo command module that carried American astronauts to the moon, and it was in the process of developing the B-1 Lancer, a supersonic strategic bomber for the United States Air Force. Its engineers thought in terms of thrust ratios and orbital mechanics and materials that did not yet have names in ordinary dictionaries. When Rockwell International acquired Admiral Corporation in October 1973 for $78 million in a stock exchange deal, the transaction made a certain cold logic from a financial perspective. Rockwell's leadership had identified a strategic vulnerability in their business model. More than 65% of their revenue came from United States government defense contracts. That kind of concentration was dangerous. A change in administration, a shift in defense priorities, a single canceled program. Any of these could devastate a company built almost entirely on government work. Rockwell needed commercial revenue, and Admiral, with its $600 million in annual sales, looked on paper like exactly the kind of large, established consumer business that could provide it. What the numbers on paper did not convey was the nature of what Admiral actually was. Admiral was not a portfolio of assets that could be optimized by aerospace engineers applying systems management principles. It was a living brand, a set of relationships between a name and the people who had trusted that name for decades, maintained by workers who understood those relationships, and by an organizational culture that had been built, brick by brick, over 40 years by a man who was no longer there. You cannot acquire that in a stock exchange deal. You cannot find it on a balance sheet. And if you do not know to look for it, you will not realize it is gone until everything that depended on it has already collapsed. Rockwell's management did not know to look for it. The integration of Admiral into Rockwell's corporate structure proceeded with the efficiency of people who were very good at managing complex engineering projects and very poorly equipped to manage a consumer brand in distress. The strategic emphasis shifted toward home appliances, the refrigerators and washing machines and electric ranges that seemed more defensible than the television business, which was visibly hemorrhaging to Japanese competition. The television and electronics divisions were treated as problems to be contained rather than businesses to be invested in and rebuilt. Resources that might have gone toward modernizing Admiral's manufacturing capabilities or closing the technology gap with Japanese competitors went instead towards stabilizing the appliance side and managing the overall cost structure of a very large, very complicated acquisition that was not performing the way the models had predicted. The people who felt this most acutely were not the executives. They were the workers on the factory floors in Illinois and the engineers in the development labs and the managers of regional operations who had spent their careers at Admiral and now found themselves reporting to a chain of command that stretched back to a defense contractor in California that built bombers for a living. The culture that Siragusa had created, direct, entrepreneurial, built on the belief that the person closest to the product usually knew best how to improve it, did not survive the transition intact. Decisions that had once been made quickly by people with deep product knowledge and direct customer relationships now move slowly through layers of corporate review designed for the management of government contracts, not consumer markets. Former employees who worked at Admiral during the Rockwell years described the period in consistent terms. Something changed, they said, not all at once, and not in any single dramatic moment, but gradually the sense that the company existed to make products that American families would be proud to own gave way to the sense that the company existed to hit quarterly targets and manage liabilities. Those are not the same thing. A workforce that has spent decades organized around the first purpose does not easily reorganize itself around the second. Who exactly was supposed to protect the people who had built this? The workers, the engineers, the franchise dealers, the communities in Galesburg and Bloomington that had oriented themselves around Admiral employment for a generation? The answer, as it turned out, was no one. In 1979, 6 years after acquiring Admiral, Rockwell sold the appliance division to Magic Chef. The television and electronics operations had already been dispersed, sold off, wound down, or allowed to atrophy to the point where they were no longer viable as going concerns. The Canadian division, which had operated independently and with considerable success through the early 1970s, was sold to a consortium of investors who, according to a former employee who worked at the Port Credit Plant in Ontario, proceeded to drain the operation of capital before it collapsed into bankruptcy in 1981. The international network that Siragusa had spent decades building, the plants in England, Mexico, Italy, Taiwan, India, was broken apart and sold in pieces to buyers who wanted the facilities or the market position, but had no interest in the brand that had made them worth having. What Magic Chef acquired in 1979 was a fragment of what Admiral had been. The appliance business was real and had genuine value. Admiral refrigerators and washing machines still sold, still carried the name recognition that decades of consumer trust had built. But the soul of the company, the thing that had made Admiral more than just a manufacturer of household goods, was gone. Magic Chef was itself acquired by Maytag in 1986, and the Admiral brand traveled with it, a name now attached to a mid-range appliance line, useful for its market recognition, stripped of the history and the culture and the specific Chicago identity that had given it meaning in the first place. By the time Maytag contracted with Montgomery Ward in 1991 to use the Admiral name exclusively on consumer electronics sold through that retail chain, the transformation was complete. The brand that had sponsored Bishop Sheen and employed 14,000 people and put the first television set into millions of American living rooms had become a retail label. A name chosen for its residual recognition value, applied to products manufactured by other companies, sold through a department store chain that would itself go bankrupt a decade later. Ross Siragusa Sr. was still alive through all of this. He died in 1996 at the age of 93. He had watched the company he built from a garage in the Depression get sold to a defense contractor, broken into pieces, and distributed across a chain of acquisitions until almost nothing remained that he would have recognized as his own. What he thought about that in the privacy of his last years is not recorded. He was, by all accounts, a man who looked forward rather than backward, a quality that had served him well in 1904, when looking backward at the ruins of his first company might have stopped him from starting again. But there is a particular kind of loss that comes not from failure, but from success followed by abandonment, from building something real and true and lasting, and then watching it be valued only for what could be extracted from it. Admiral was not destroyed by incompetence. It was not destroyed by a single catastrophic decision or a moment of obvious recklessness. It was dismantled methodically and without malice by people who understood its financial value and never once grasped what it actually was. That distinction matters, because what Admiral actually was, a brand built by a self-made immigrant son for the working families of America, on the promise that they deserved good things too, was not something that could be transferred in a stock deal or preserved in a corporate restructuring. It existed in the relationship between the name and the people who had trusted it. And once that relationship was broken, no amount of brand licensing or retail exclusivity could put it back together again. The collapse of Admiral Corporation did not announce itself with a single headline. There was no bankruptcy filing that made the front page of the Chicago Tribune. There was no product recall that turned the brand toxic overnight. There was no scandal, no fraud, no moment of public reckoning that gave the end of Admiral the kind of dramatic clarity that makes a story easy to tell. What happened instead was something quieter, and in its own way more devastating. A slow disaggregation, a gradual peeling away of everything that had made the name mean something, conducted over the better part of 2 decades by a succession of owners who understood the asset value of what they held without understanding its human value at all. But slow collapses have their own specific moments of rupture. And for the people who lived through Admiral's dissolution, the workers, the engineers, the factory floor supervisors who had given decades of their working lives to the company, those moments were not abstract. They were the day the shift schedule changed and did not change back. They were the meeting where a manager from California explained a restructuring that nobody in the room had been consulted about. They were the morning the parking lot was half empty for the first time anyone could remember. In the afternoon, the rumor started that the Galesburg plant was next. When Rockwell acquired Admiral in October 1973, the transaction was framed publicly as a strategic expansion. A defense and aerospace giant diversifying into consumer markets, bringing its engineering excellence to bear on the challenges facing American electronics manufacturers. The workers at Cortlandt Street heard the announcement and waited to see what it meant in practice. What it meant in practice, over the months and years that followed, was a steady erosion of the autonomy and the culture that had defined Admiral since Siragusa built it. Decisions that had once been made in Chicago now required approval from California. Product development timelines lengthened. The entrepreneurial instinct that had driven Admiral from a garage to a global enterprise, the willingness to make a fast decision on imperfect information because the market would not wait, was replaced by the kind of deliberate, process-driven management that made sense for a company building spacecraft, but was catastrophically ill-suited to a consumer electronics brand fighting for its life against Japanese competitors who could bring a new product to market in months. The television division deteriorated first and fastest. By the mid-1970s, Japanese manufacturers had effectively won the American television market. Not won a portion of it, won it. Sony, Panasonic, Hitachi, and a half dozen other brands had taken the market share, the shelf space, and the consumer preference that American manufacturers had built over the previous quarter century. And they had done it with products that were demonstrably better and demonstrably cheaper than what the domestic industry could offer. Admiral's television business, which had been the foundation of everything Siragusa built, was no longer viable as an independent operation. Rockwell did not invest in rebuilding it. Rockwell wound it down. For the workers whose jobs depended on television manufacturing, this was not a strategic adjustment. It was the end of a livelihood. Men and women who had spent 15, 20, 25 years on the assembly lines at Cortlandt Street and at the satellite plants in Illinois found themselves holding layoff notices for a reason that had nothing to do with their performance and everything to do with decisions made in boardrooms they had never entered, by people who had never set foot on a factory floor in Chicago. The specific cruelty of deindustrialization is that it is impersonal. The forces that eliminate a job are vast and structural and remote, and the person who loses that job has no one to argue with and nowhere to direct the grief. In 1979, Rockwell sold Admiral's appliance division to Magic Chef. The sale completed the dismemberment that had begun 6 years earlier. Whatever remained of Admiral as an integrated enterprise, as a company with a coherent identity and a unified direction, ceased to exist at that moment. What Magic Chef acquired was a collection of product lines and manufacturing assets wearing an Admiral label. The name had value. The history behind the name had been effectively severed from it. The Canadian operation tells its own version of the same story. The Port Credit Plant in Ontario, which had been running since 1946 and had operated with genuine success through the early 1970s, was sold by Rockwell to a consortium of private investors. A former employee who worked there through the transition described what followed in terms that will be familiar to anyone who has watched a private acquisition go wrong. The new owners, he said, were not interested in building anything. They were interested in what could be extracted. Capital that should have gone into modernizing the plant and maintaining competitiveness went elsewhere. The workforce shrank. The product quality declined. In 1981, the Canadian Admiral operation collapsed into bankruptcy. The plant closed. The jobs were gone. The community that had organized itself around that employment for 35 years was left to find another anchor, in an era when another anchor was not easy to find. The international network and the plants in England, Mexico, Italy, Taiwan, India that Siragusa had spent decades assembling was broken apart and dispersed in the same period. Each facility was sold to buyers who wanted the physical asset or the market position it represented. None of them wanted Admiral as Admiral. The brand that had operated in 110 countries was reduced, piece by piece, to a trademark attached to whatever product line happened to be carrying it at a given moment. By the time Magic Chef was acquired by Maytag in 1986, the Admiral name had been traveling through corporate hands for 13 years. Maytag was a legitimate appliance company with real manufacturing capabilities, and a genuine understanding of the consumer market. Under Maytag's ownership, Admiral appliances, refrigerators, washing machines, dryers, continued to be manufactured and sold. The products were real, the quality was adequate, but the brand had been repositioned definitively and without apology as a value option. The choice you made when you wanted a functioning appliance at the lowest possible price, with no particular expectation of the pride or the identity that the Admiral name had once carried. In 1991, Maytag struck a deal with Montgomery Ward, the retail chain, granting it exclusive use of the Admiral brand on consumer electronics products sold through Ward stores. For anyone who remembered what Admiral had been, who remembered the Sid Caesar sponsorship, the Bishop Sheen broadcasts, the million television sets a year coming off the Chicago assembly lines, the arrangement had a particular quality of diminishment. The name that had once defined American consumer electronics was now a retail private label, existing at the pleasure of a department store chain, applied to products with no connection to the engineers and workers and founder who had made it worth anything in the first place. Montgomery Ward went bankrupt in 2000 and closed all of its stores. The Admiral consumer electronics label went with it. There was no announcement, no ceremony, no acknowledgement in the press that something which had once mattered enormously to millions of American families had quietly ceased to exist in any meaningful form. The website did not go dark dramatically. The last product was not commemorated. It simply stopped. At what point does a name stop being a brand and become only a ghost? A word that carries the memory of value without possessing any of the substance that created it. The appliance line continued under Maytag, and when Whirlpool acquired Maytag in 2006, it acquired Admiral along with everything else. Today, Admiral branded refrigerators and washing machines are sold exclusively through Home Depot, positioned at the entry level of the market, manufactured on Whirlpool's production platforms with no operational connection to the company Ross Siragusa built. They are functional, they are affordable, they are, by every reasonable measure, decent appliances. But in the houses where Admiral televisions once glowed on Tuesday evenings, while Bishop Sheen spoke to 30 million people at once, in the towns where Admiral factory workers raised their families on wages that meant something and work that meant something more. In all of those places, what Admiral was is gone, not transformed, not evolved. Gone in the specific way that things go when the people who understood their value are no longer the ones making decisions about them. The lights on the Cortlandt Street plant went out a long time ago. The building still stands. But the thing it housed, the particular combination of ambition and craft and immigrant determination and democratic faith in the American consumer, that left when Rockwell arrived, and it never came back. When a company the size of Admiral disappears, not overnight, but across 2 decades of gradual dismemberment, the question of what replaced it is more complicated than it first appears. In the narrow commercial sense, the answer is straightforward. Japanese manufacturers replaced Admiral in the television market. Whirlpool and its portfolio of brands absorbed the appliance business. The shelf space that Admiral products once occupied was filled by other products, and American consumers, as consumers do, adapted and moved on. The market did not mourn. Markets never do. But the communities that had organized themselves around Admiral's existence did not have the market's capacity for indifference. Galesburg, Illinois is a useful place to look. The city of roughly 30,000 people in western Illinois had been home to Admiral manufacturing operations for decades. One of the satellite plants that Siragusa had established as the company expanded beyond its Chicago base in the early 1950s. When those operations wound down through the 1970s, Galesburg did not simply absorb the loss and reconfigure around a new economic anchor. It entered a long, grinding period of industrial decline that Admiral's departure accelerated and that subsequent decades only deepened. By the time a Maytag refrigerator plant, unrelated to Admiral but part of the same broader story of American appliance manufacturing, closed in Galesburg in 2004, taking another 1,000 jobs with it, the city had been losing industrial employment for 30 years. The Admiral plant closure was not the cause of all of that, but it was part of the beginning of it, and the people who lived through the beginning understood that something had been set in motion that would not easily be stopped. The Canadian story ended more abruptly. The Port Credit Plant in Ontario, sold by Rockwell to private investors after the 1973 acquisition, collapsed into bankruptcy in 1981. The investors who had acquired it had extracted what they could and left the workforce with nothing. Former employees who had spent their careers at Canadian Admiral, who had built their financial lives around the assumption that the plant would continue because it had always continued, found themselves in their 40s and 50s looking for work in a manufacturing sector that was contracting across the board. The specific bitterness of that experience was not the job loss itself, painful as that was. It was the knowledge that the plant had not failed because the people in it had failed. It had failed because the people who owned it had treated it as a source of short-term extraction rather than a long-term enterprise worth protecting. The broader industry lesson that Admiral's collapse carried was one that the American electronics industry either did not hear clearly enough or heard and could not act on in time. Admiral was not an isolated case. It was the first major American consumer electronics manufacturer to be effectively dismantled by the combination of Japanese competition and domestic financial mismanagement. But it was not the last. Zenith, which had been Admiral's great Chicago rival, fought longer and harder to remain an American television manufacturer, eventually selling its television business to LG Electronics of South Korea in 1995. RCA, the company that had once seemed too large and too central to American life to ever disappear, was acquired by General Electric in 1986, and its consumer electronics division was eventually sold to a French company. Magnavox, Sylvania, Curtis Mathes, the roster of American television brands that existed in 1970 and no longer exist today as American enterprises is long enough to constitute its own documentary. Admiral arrived at that destination first, and in arriving first, it carried a warning that the industry had the opportunity to heed and largely did not. The revival attempts were modest and in the end, instructive. The Admiral name was periodically reattached to new product lines by successive owners. Maytag used it for appliances, Montgomery Ward used it for electronics, and after Ward's bankruptcy, the name continued in the appliance market under Maytag and then Whirlpool. None of these constituted a revival in any meaningful sense. A revival requires not just a name, but a reason for the name to matter. A story, a set of values, a relationship with consumers that gives the brand substance beyond its trademark registration. No one who owned the Admiral name after Rockwell acquired the company in 1973 invested in rebuilding that relationship. The name was a tool for moving product, and it was used as such. There is a footnote to the Admiral story that carries its own quiet poetry. The Milwaukee Admirals, a professional ice hockey team in the American Hockey League, derived their name from Admiral appliances. In 1971, when the team was sold by its original owner, one of the new investors was a man named Edwin Mirar, who owned an appliance store and sold Admiral refrigerators. The team was renamed in honor of the brand that stocked his shelves. Today, the Milwaukee Admirals still play, still wear that name, still fill an arena in a city that has no particular connection to Ross Siragusa or to the factories in Chicago and Galesburg where the brand was built. The hockey team outlasted the company. The name that Siragusa bought for $200 in 1936 now belongs, in its most visible American application, to a minor league hockey franchise in Wisconsin. What do we lose when a brand disappears and nothing takes its place? Not the product, which can always be replaced by another product, but the specific relationship between a name and the people who trusted it, the specific pride of the workers who made what that name promised, the specific community that formed around the work? The answer is not nothing. It is not sentimental to say so. The Admiral Corporation at its peak was not just a manufacturer of consumer electronics. It was a demonstration that an immigrant son with no college degree and $3,400 could build something that the whole country needed and used and valued. It was a proof of a particular kind of American possibility, not the possibility of infinite wealth or effortless success, but the possibility of making something real for people who needed real things and being rewarded for it with the kind of institutional trust that takes generations to build. When that possibility is foreclosed, when the companies that embodied it are dismantled, and the communities that depended on them are left to manage the consequences alone. What is lost is not merely economic. It is a specific kind of confidence in the idea that making things in America, for Americans, by Americans, is a viable and worthy enterprise. Admiral's collapse did not cause that loss of confidence, but it contributed to it in the way that every first casualty contributes to the war. Picture a living room in America in 1952. It does not matter which city, which state, which neighborhood. The living room is specific enough that anyone who was there will recognize it. There is a sofa with cushions that have been sat into softness over years of evening use. There is a lamp in the corner throwing a warm circle of light across the ceiling. There are photographs on a side table and a radio that has sat in the same spot since before the war. And a smell that is particular to that house and that family, something between furniture polish and cooking and the specific warmth of a space that is genuinely lived in. And then there is the new thing. It sits against the wall where nothing sat before. A compact machine in a brown bakelite cabinet, 17 inches of screen that glows with a blue-gray light, unlike anything that room has ever contained. The family has saved for it carefully and brought it home on a Saturday and spent the afternoon figuring out where to put it and how to position the antenna. And now it is Tuesday evening and Bishop Sheen is on. And 30 million other Americans are watching the same thing at the same moment. And the word on the cabinet, in clean, unassuming letters that manage to be both modest and authoritative at the same time, is Admiral. That is the moment. Not the revenue figure, not the production number, not the stock price. That Tuesday evening in that living room, with that family gathered around, something new that felt against all reasonable expectation, like it had always belonged there. That is what Admiral was, at its best and most itself. The company that produced that moment was built by a man who understood, with a clarity that formal education might actually have obscured, what ordinary Americans needed and what they deserved. Ross Siragusa was not a visionary in the way that word is used today. He was not predicting futures or disrupting industries or building platforms. He was a manufacturer in the oldest and most honorable sense of that word. He made things. He made them well enough to be proud of. He priced them honestly enough that the people who needed them could have them. And he built an organization around those two commitments that lasted, in its original form, for nearly 4 decades. What Admiral enabled was not just entertainment, though it enabled that too. It enabled a kind of national simultaneity that had never existed before and has not existed in quite the same way since. When 30 million Americans watched Bishop Sheen on a Tuesday evening, or gathered around their sets on a July night in 1969 to watch a human being walk on the moon, they were not merely consuming the same content. They were sharing the same moment, the same image, the same sound, the same collective intake of breath at the same instant. The screen that made that possible in millions of those homes was an Admiral. The company that put it there was run by a self-made man from Chicago who had believed, since the Depression, that the American working family deserved a seat at whatever table the future was setting. That belief produced something real. It produced factories that employed thousands of people in Illinois towns that are still feeling the absence of that employment 50 years later. It produced a brand that 3 generations of American families trusted without ever being given a reason to distrust it. It produced a name that meant something specific, not glamour, not exclusivity, not aspiration toward a life that most people could not have, but honest quality at an honest price, made by American workers for American homes. In a country that has spent the last half-century learning to be suspicious of that kind of promise, Admiral's fulfillment of it deserves to be remembered. The men and women who worked at 3800 West Cortlandt Street in Chicago, who ran the assembly lines and staffed the engineering labs and drove the delivery trucks and answered the phones in the customer service department, built something that outlasted their individual contributions to it by decades. They built it with the knowledge that the sets coming off their lines were going into the homes of people like themselves, into neighborhoods like their own, into the living rooms where children were being raised and families were being formed. That knowledge is not a small thing. It is, in fact, one of the rarest things that working life can offer. The certainty that what you make matters to the people who receive it. Admiral is gone now in every sense that counts. The name survives on entry-level appliances sold through a home improvement chain, and the connection between that label and the company Ross Siragusa built in 1934 is a legal continuity with no human substance behind it. The Cortlandt Street plant still stands in Chicago, repurposed and unrecognizable. The factories in Galesburg and Bloomington have been empty for decades, or torn down, or converted to uses that have nothing to do with the manufacture of anything. The workers who spent their careers inside those buildings are mostly gone too, retired or passed, or living in the specific quiet of people who made something important and watched it be taken away. But the televisions are still out there, not working mostly, not powered up and receiving a signal, but present in attics and basements and the back rooms of antique stores, in the careful collections of people who understand that a machine can carry history in its cabinet the way a house carries history in its walls. A 1954 Admiral T1812B in brown bakelite, 17-inch screen, chrome dial, the word Admiral in its clean lettering on the front. That set is a document. It is a record of a specific American moment, a specific American promise, and a specific American man who believed that ordinary people deserved to hold the future in their living rooms. Somewhere tonight, someone is explaining to a younger person what it felt like to watch the moon landing on a television that their parents had saved up for and carried home on a Saturday, and positioned against the wall of a room that was never quite the same afterward. The younger person will not fully understand. The experience of that particular kind of wonder, of a technology so new that it still felt like a gift rather than a utility, in a room where the whole family gathered because there was nowhere else to be, is not transferable by description alone. But they will understand, from the way it is described, that something real was here, something made with care, by people who meant it, for people who needed it. Something that lit up American living rooms for a generation and asked nothing in return except to be trusted. Admiral asked to be trusted. For 40 years, it earned that trust completely. That is not nothing. In the long story of American industry, that is very close to everything.